بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So, inshallah, in today's lecture, we are going to kind of turn a little bit to talk about the history of the madhab itself. So, up until now, almost half the lectures, pretty much, we've been talking about the man himself, Imam Shafi'i. We've talked about his biography, his intellectual history, some of the streams of Islamic law that he took from, etc., etc. Today we are going to transition into something else in which we are going to talk about the history of the madhab itself. So, what I would like to do for today's lecture is I would like to give you, this is essentially an introduction to the historical framework by which we will come to understand the history of our madhab. So, we will look at a few stages. I'm carving up in the lectures 6 stages, and as I said before, these are artificial constructs. It's not like one stage begins and ends, with a dramatic event, but it's our way of trying to impose some order on this large intellectual history. So I will outline for you the time periods between the different stages, and it is important that you remember a smaller version of that. So I will begin by giving you just 4 brief stages that are pretty much how all Shafi'i students will remember and understand the history. And then from those 4 stages, I'll expand it a little bit more detail into 6. What's important for you to remember are those 4 main stages. So in your mind, always you kind of have an operation of what's happening. You have an order of what's happening. Then, when we conclude that towards the end of the lecture, I will actually get into the first stage, and we will talk about why there is a difference between the Iraqi school, the Khurasani school, I will get into why there is an old school, the Madhab al-Qadim and Madhab al-Jadid of Imam al-Shafi'i, and that will conclude for us this lecture. So again, we are going to talk about an overview of how we historically understand the development of the Shafi'i madhab. I want you to remember the basic 4 stages. I will come to expand it and add a little, 2 more, and then inshallah towards the end of the lecture we will start talking about why there was an old madhab and a new madhab, inshallah. Okay, so inshallah, to begin, there's always a limitation when we come as modern people to try to look back at a history that expands more than 1,000 years and trying to come up with some kind of order. So from today's lecture onwards, we are going to do our best to talk about the historical order of the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i, and I will defend a little bit why we have these different stages, because while there are artificial, human constructs, there's a justification for it. There's a reason why we consider looking at our madhab in these different historical stages, because there are significant events that happen that when those events happen, there's a significant difference between the things that happened before the madhab and then the things that happened after the madhab. So that moment those people become a watershed moment. We will come to see that it's not like 1 day or 1 second or 1 hour in the day, but it's a time period in which, and these time periods usually revolve around personalities. So when certain ulama live, as we will come to see, those who redacted the madhab, those who did the tanqih of the madhab, those people around their time, the writings of the madhab afterwards are fundamentally altered from the writings before the madhab, so therefore we consider this a milestone. So I will do some of that justification, but I want you to always keep in the back of your mind that these are just, our attempt at looking at history. Now, another thing that I want to say in the beginning before we talk about the actual historical periods and stages is I want to talk a little bit about ijtihad. We talked about it prior, we touched on it, but I think it's important that we spend a little bit more time talking about ijtihad. In the early, Orientalist study of Islam, the early Orientalist study of Islam that happened through, much of the 18th century let's say. There were some attempts before, but it's sort of 18th century and it kind of continues till today, was largely done out of colonial and economic interest. In other words, certain European governments were interested in controlling certain aspects of the world for trade purposes, geopolitical purposes. Many of those aspects of the world were Muslim majority countries, so therefore they sent different scholars to understand these people so that they can sort of control them. Part of that understanding was at that time Islamic law was the legal system, of these areas. So they sent these people to go study Islamic law. So ironically, we have many early translations of, in the case of the Shafi'i madhab, of Shafi'i works that hail back to this time period, because a lot of the Malay world, current day Indonesia, Malaysia, a lot of that part of the world was and is Shafi'i majority. So there is a Dutch Orientalist, Christian Hergrunyi Snoek, who was one of the leading people at that time period, and he translated different aspects of Imam al-Bayjuri's Hashia on the commentary of Ibn Qasim on the Matn of Abi Shuja. And in his trying to understand, Imam al-Bayjuri has a comment in the very beginning of the book when he talks about, I think he's commenting on Imam al-Shafi'i like al-Mujtahid, or there's like some kind of phraseology between the Sharh and the Matn that he's commenting on. And he says something along the lines, and this type of ijtihad no longer exists or ended in the 3rd Islamic century, etc. And it was from this reading that this Orientalist coined this term, the closing of the gates of ijtihad. And unfortunately, many Muslims and students of Sharia and even ulama themselves adopt this terminology because it's something that's existed for a couple hundred years now, adopt this terminology and also use it to talk about the closing of the gates of ijtihad. The fact of the matter is that there are no gates to ijtihad. There are only simple conditions, shurut. If you have those shurut, you engage in ijtihad. If you don't have those shurut, you can't engage in ijtihad. It's not like some cinematic moment where, I have ijtihad. No, it's like, your ijtihad, the root word, the root for ijtihad, jahada, is to exert effort. It's the same root that we have jihad. It's an intellectual battle that you are using all of your skills, all of your memory, all of your understanding to engage with the primary sources and make sense of them. So you either have it or you don't, or you work towards it. As I said in the previous lecture or two, one of the things that Imam Shafi'i promoted amongst his students was the importance of ijtihad. As a matter of fact, he disliked the idea of taqlid. Now, not everyone can be a mujtahid. Of course, most of us will end up being people of taqlid. But in the Shafi'i madhab itself, as we will come to see all throughout history, there were people engaging in ijtihad. So ijtihad has, certain conditions. The conditions are that you are well versed with the verses of the ahkam, the verses related to the rulings of the Sharia and the Quran, that you have an understanding of the hadith that are related to the ahkam. Those, by the way, are very limited. There's about 300-400 ayat in the Quran dealing with the ahkam. There's about 2,000 plus or minus a couple hundred hadith dealing with the ahkam. That's easy. You have to understand the Arabic language because the language of the tashri'ah is in the Arabic language. And if you know those basic tools, plus how to interpret the adillah, which are the subject chapters of the books of usul al-fiqh that we study. You understand, al-khas wal-aam, you understand al-mutlaq wal-muqayyad, you understand al-nasikh wal-mansukh, so on and so forth. Then you understand how to weigh the evidence. Once you have those tools, then you do it. You engage in ijtihad. You might mess up, you might make mistakes, you might fall short, but the Prophet ﷺ narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said rather that the mujtahid who engages in ijtihad and is wrong gets one reward, and the mujtahid that engages in ijtihad and is right gets two reward. In the narration of Daraqutni, it says that the mujtahid who engages in ijtihad and is correct gets 10 reward. So even if you mess up your ijtihad, but you have those prerequisites, you're rewarded for the effort. So ijtihad is something that's very important. And there is this kind of literature or thing that's going around with Muslims that it doesn't exist. It's so hard. Those type of people no longer exist, and that's defeatist mentality. That's not our mentality at all. Nor should it be. It should be something that we aspire to. The conditions are there. It's known. It's not rocket science. You just have to do it. It's hard work, and you have to do it. And if you have the stamina to do it, inshallah, Allah will give you tawfiq to do it. So when you read in the literature that this type of ijtihad no longer exists, let's go back to that. What does that mean? There is, when you ask a normal person, what is ijtihad? Is it, the highest form of ijtihad? Ijtihad is ijtihad al-mutlaq. And then after that is ijtihad al-muqayyad. And then after that is, ijtihad al-madhab. And then after that is ijtihad al-fatwa. They'll give you some kind of order. So you would think by hearing that mujtahid al-mutlaq, absolute ijtihad, is the highest form of ijtihad. But there is a type of ijtihad that is above that. That type of ijtihad no longer exists. And that's the muqannin. That's the mujtahid that invents the tools of ijtihad themselves. That's the ijtihad of a Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, Malik, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, al-Awza'i, Layth ibn Sa'd, so on and so, all of the great luminaries of the Salaf. That's the type of ijtihad that no longer exists. Why? Because we have all the tools. All the tools are there. There's no new tool. Maybe theoretically somebody can invent like half a tool, today, or like one, tool, but it's not going to be as seismic and tectonic as a shift as what happened at the time of the Salaf. So because that type of ijtihad really no longer exists, most of the people don't mention it. So they just say, or they refer to it as an absolute type of ijtihad. So, but when you do the tafsil of it, when you actually categorize them and give them the proper names, you will understand that ijtihad al-mutlaq means something, and that mujtahid al-mustaqil or mujtahid al-muqannin means something else. That's the type of ijtihad that the authors were talking about that no longer exists. ما دون ذلك, what is lesser than that of ijtihad is open, inshallah, until the end of time. So why am I saying all of this? Well, it's one of the things that you need to know about ijtihad, because it has to do with fiqh and usul, etc. But also, when we come to study the Shafi'i madhab, the history of the madhab itself, we will come to learn that there were many attempts at ijtihad. There were many people who had reached the level of ijtihad. So in a way, it's also looking at the history of ijtihad. It's looking at the history of usul al-fiqh, because it is the usul is the engine of a madhab. It's what makes the madhab keep going when it's applied. So this is a undercurrent theme through the next, basically from now until the end of this course, in which we discuss the history of the madhab, inshallah. Okay, so now that I got some of those introductory remarks out of the way, let us jump in to look at the sketch of the history of the school. So of course the first level, or the first period that any historian would want to look at, is the life of Imam Shafi'i himself, which alhamdulillah we were able to do over several lectures. I hope that was beneficial for you all. And there are books that have been written, biographies of Imam Shafi'i, and his life is well documented. His early works are well documented. So it would make sense that we would spend several, lectures and several hours looking at that, because there's a lot there. There's a lot that we know about him. He was not an unknown figure. So from the time of his birth until the time of his death, radiallahu anhu, in 204, that will be stage number one. Now, the second stage we refer to as the stage of transmission, which happens from the time of his death in 204 until the end of the year 500 of the Hijrah. Which means that, till the year 500 of the Hijrah. Why do we pick that date? Well, first of all, what does it mean by the age of transmission? The age of transmission is that we said that Imam Shafi'i, when he passed away or when he got to Egypt, he started codifying what was in his mind the final school, the final understanding of the madhab. That's what the madhab al-jadid is, which we'll end the lecture with that. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. So he started writing, he started codifying. So the minute he passes away, radiallahu anhu, his students, his immediate students, which we'll talk about shortly, they exert their effort to transmit that body of knowledge to the people afterwards. So for the first few centuries, there's just a lot of transmission of the madhab. Whether it's Buwiti's works, whether it's Al-Muzani's works, which are compendiums of what Imam al-Shafi'i said, or the works of Imam al-Shafi'i himself. Why do we end with the year 500? Because the year 500 is the end of the time period of the Salaf. So the Salaf ends with people like Imam al-Bayhaqi, who dies in 458, Imam al-Ghazali, who dies in 505. So those, you see how there's a span of time between about 50 years. But when Muslims look at intellectual history, they pin it around people. So around those type of people, that generation of people, that is what is the widest definition of the time of the Salaf, from the time of the Sahaba till the end of the 5th Islamic century. So that coincides with a larger Islamic historical milestone, the age of the Salaf. And for us in the Shafi'i madhab, we look at that time period as a time period of transmission. Now, the next milestone is what we call the first tanqiyah, or the first recension or redaction of the madhab. That revolves around two central figures, Imam al-Rafi'i and Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahumullah. And then the middle period, or the next major milestone, lasts until it goes up until the end of the 9th Islamic century, in which we have a second tanqiyah, a second redaction or recension, which takes place around two luminary late Shafi'i figures, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami and Imam al-Ramli. I just want to get you the dates of something. So, when we talk about the tanqiyah of the madhab, here it is. The first tanqiyah, when I said Imam al-Rafi'i and Imam al-Nawawi, I want to just get you their dates. Imam al-Nawawi dies in the year 676. Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah, passes away after Imam al-Ramli. So from 500 to 676, less than 200 years, that's the third period. So let's just do it from the beginning. We have the establishment of the madhab with Imam al-Shafi'i himself. And then after that, we have the transmission of the madhab, that's from 204 to 500. And then we have a third period, which is from 500 to the end of until Imam al-Nawawi's death, 676. That third period ends with the second tanqiyah, second recension, which I'll describe. And then from that period, the middle period goes until the second tanqiyah of al-Haytami and al-Ramli, and that ends, Imam al-Ramli dies in the year 1004. And then I guess after that would be from then till now, the last 300-400 years. Those are the major milestones of the madhab. Now, you might have minor demarcations of time, which we will kind of do a little bit of that, but those milestones are pretty much set in stone. And let me give you an understanding of why. In the beginning, there's the establishment, there's the time period of Imam Shafi'i himself. I hope that makes sense to everyone. He's the man that started it, so that period will end with his life, with the end of his life, radiyallahu anhu. Now after that, there's the narration of the madhab. It is during these first few hundred years, from the year 204 to about the year 500, that there are two streams of the Shafi'i madhab that emerge. There's the Iraqi school and the Khurasani school. And this has a lot to do with the fact that Imam Shafi'i himself hopped around a lot. We talked about he went to Baghdad 3 times, he was in Yemen, and he was in Medina, and then he came to Egypt. So he traveled a lot. He traveled frequently for somebody at that time period. And every time he goes somewhere, he's dropping down knowledge and dropping down students. So there emerge these two streams. One of the things that Imam al-Rafi'i and Imam al-Nawawi do is they bring those streams together so that there is one madhab. So when we study the madhab now, we're not studying, oh, this is what the Iraqi Shafi'i say or the Khurasani Shafi'i say. This is what the madhab says, or this is the mu'tamid of the madhab. Imam al-Rafi'i comes first, then Imam al-Nawawi, and actually the streams technically come together a couple of generations before Imam al-Nawawi. He mentions that in the beginning of his Majmu'. We'll get to that in great detail later, inshallah. But he is the one that makes the union of these two approaches and solidifies and codifies it. So that is why in the madhab, we will oftentimes, if you want a quick answer, you will oftentimes just pick up a book of Nawawi in the madhab and say, what does Nawawi say? When we say that inside, if we are in a classroom of the Shafi'is and we say Nawawi says this, khalas, then the debate is over. That is the opinion of the madhab, and then we will come to understand why. And because of that statement that I just made, he marks this huge milestone. Now, from Imam al-Nawawi later, there are other types of attempts to make mukhtasars of the different earlier books. And there are other issues that obviously Imam al-Nawawi is a human, he couldn't do everything. So there are still other issues that come together. So then the madhab is further codified between al-Haytami and al-Ramli. When it comes to al-Haytami and al-Ramli, all of the Shafi'is will take from al-Haytami's position over al-Ramli, except the Shafi'is of Egypt. They will prefer the positions of al-Ramli over al-Haytami. Here we're talking about minor issues altogether, but we will come to understand that as a Shafi'i, like, because I'm an Egyptian Shafi'i, so when I go to the Sham or if I meet an Iraqi Shafi'i or something like that, I am also sometimes aware that when you get into the discussion, there are slight differences and emphasis on different things, because for example, they'll quote al-Haytami's works and they might not quote al-Ramli's works, whereas I'm more familiar with quoting al-Ramli's works because that's the environment that I studied in. So those type of milestones, because of the impact that those people have, those milestones become important. So just to review, we're going to look at these basic chunks of time. The time of the founder of the madhab, which we've just concluded, which ends with the passing of Imam Shafi'i in 204. And then after that, we have the transmission of the madhab from 204 to about the year 500, which also coincides with the age of the Salaf. And then from 500 to 676, ending with the death of Imam al-Nawawi, which ends the first tanqih of the madhab. That's another time period. And then from the death of Imam al-Nawawi from 676 all the way to the year 1004, this is the middle period that ends with the second tanqih. And then we can add from the death of Imam al-Ramli 1004 to us today. At the time of this recording, it's 1444. So those 400 years, those will be the rough period of time. And inshallah, in the next and final clip for this lecture, I will give you another demarcation that has a little bit more detail, inshallah. Okay, why am I giving you another demarcation or further demarcation? Repetition. I want you to all understand this stuff inside and outside. So while I gave you in the previous clip a rough understanding, that rough understanding, by the way, of history of the madhab is pretty much how any Shafi'i would understand the madhab. So what I'm about to give you today is a little bit of me putting order on the history for the purposes of these courses and these classes. So you don't have to, I'm not going to hold a gun to your head and be like, you have to memorize this. But the previous lecture, the previous clip, you got to know that stuff. You have to know that there's the founder, that there's the transmission, and then there's the middle period up until the first tanqiyah, and then there's the period after that up until the second tanqiyah, and then from that to our time. That's pretty much set in stone. I know I kind of said that this is a human construct, but this might be an exception, because the tanqiyah of the madhab, the two tanqihat of the madhab, are so impactful in how the madhab is written, how it's transmitted, how it's studied, that you have to know that. Nobody today is going to go back and study like the Mukhtasar of al-Muzani. You don't study that in a classroom. You might look at that for research purposes or something like that, but you're not. You're going to always study the later books. Why do we study the later books? The answer is in those those periods of time in which the madhabs are brought together, the terminology is hammered down, the language is pinned down, and then books are then compiled based on those books. But those books of the tanqihat are an editing of the books that came before them, or a summary of them in any case. Okay. We're going to look at, if we look at another way of looking at the history of the madhab, is to look at the stage one of the madhab would be from Imam Shafi'i's birth up until the end of the death of Rabi'a, which takes place in the year 270. So that extends it a little bit. And why I extend it a little bit is because we will come to see that Imam Shafi'i's Egyptian students, the students who lived with him towards the end of his life, especially Imam al-Rabi'a, was a massive narrator. Thousands of people heard the books of Imam Shafi'i, and specifically the Risala from al-Rabi'a. There would be hundreds of people who would come to the man's house. He would open his front door and there would be hundreds of people outside, literally in the streets. That's what the history books say. Just line up in the streets, waiting for them, for him to narrate another chapter, another page of Imam Shafi'i's works. Now, we talked about how the three main students of Imam Shafi'i, we'll get to that shortly, but the three main students of Imam Shafi'i, they had different skill sets. Rabi'a's skill set was in two. Allah Ta'ala gave him long life. So Imam Shafi'i dies in 204, but he dies in 270. So he lives over 60 years past Imam Shafi'i's life. And then in those 60 years, he transmitted this madhab to hundreds and if not thousands of people. Literally, I mean, the proliferation is mind-boggling. So therefore, if we're going to consider the first stage of the madhab, we would want to include that because he is just simply narrating those works. The second stage will take place from 270 to 505. 505, if you remember, is the death year of Imam al-Ghazali. And it is in this stage that we have the proliferation of the two schools. That when I say the two schools, I mean the Iraqi and Khurasani school. I don't mean the old and the new madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i. We call that old and new. But when I say two schools, I mean the school of the Khurasanis and the schools of the Iraqi. So from 270 to 505, that's where you have the transmission and the proliferation of those two streams. And then from 505 to 676, which is the year in which Imam al-Nawawi dies, we have the stage 3, which is a ongoing process of this movement towards the tanqih, the bringing of the two streams together, and then the redaction of the madhab, addressing things that might be differences of opinion, differences of wording, and things like that. That ends with the effort of Imam al-Nawawi. So it's not like there's one big conference called the Tanqih conference and then they sign a document and it's over. It's a process that takes place largely between Imam al-Rafi'i and Imam al-Nawawi. And then the fourth stage will be from the death of Imam al-Nawawi from 676 to the year 1004. As I mentioned before, that's the death year of Imam al-Ramli. That is Imam al-Haytami, rahimahullah, is before him. So Imam al-Haytami and Imam al-Ramli's efforts is the second Tanqih. And then the fifth stage will be from the death of Imam al-Ramli 104 to 1335, which is the death of Sayyid Alawi ibn Ahmed al-Saqqaf, who was one of the great Meccan Shafi'i fuqaha of the later period. And then this last stage will be from the death of al-Saqqaf in 1335 to our time, now it's 1444, or later whenever you're watching these videos. So let's say roughly 100 years, the last 100 years. Now, another thing that we will learn when we talk about these time periods is we will also learn that these time periods are also important. Why we pin them around these personalities is because those books written by those personalities become the authoritative level books. So the most authoritative books would be the books of Rafi' and al-Nawawi. And if there's a difference of opinion, we take al-Nawawi's over al-Rafi'i. And then after that, the next level of authoritative books will be the books of al-Haytami and al-Ramli. If there's a difference of opinion, all of the Shafi'is take from al-Haytami, except for the Egyptian Shafi'is that prefer al-Ramli. that will impact the type of books that we study. The only exception to all of this, which is just like an exception of barakah, is the matn of Abi Shuja'. Because Abi Shuja', radiallahu anhu, mashallah, he was from the Salaf. He even has a chain of transmission that narrates a hadith back to the Prophet in which he is mentioned. I mean, he is from the Salaf. And that book, mashallah, is just like a miracle of barakah. It's the only exception where it's a very old book, but yet we continue to study it. But we study it with a modern commentary, meaning one of the commentaries that comes after these redactions or these tanqihat. But other than that, those books. So you want to know what is the book of the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i? The Minhaj of Imam al-Nawawi. That's the standard book. Now, when I say that statement, as we come to study it, you will know why that's the most important book and why there are all these commentaries. So Al-Haytami has a commentary, Al-Ramli has a commentary. Then there's the Majmu'ah of Imam al-Nawawi, and then there's the Rawda of Imam al-Nawawi. So these are the major books. This is where you go to when you need to ask when you need to research something, so on and so forth. Okay, in the final couple minutes that we have, I would like to look at stage one briefly, and then of course we can pick this up in the next lecture. We have this story that I wanted to narrate to you, that is narrated by Al-Karabisi, who died in the year 248, who was one of Imam al-Shafi'i's Iraqi students. And he says that when Imam al-Shafi'i came to Egypt for his third time, I asked to read with him or to narrate from him his fiqh works that I had studied with him before. And then he told me he refused, and he said, rather take the books of fiqh that I left with a Za'farani by way of ijaza. So this story reminds us of this important fact that Imam al-Shafi'i's madhab was evolving in his mind really all throughout his life. As any intellectual project, it grows and inshallah thrives. So Imam al-Shafi'i, by the time he was leaving Baghdad for the last time and contemplating going to Egypt, he had realized, okay, there's stuff that I've been teaching before, but I have a newer way or a sharper way or a better way of addressing it. So from now on, I'm gonna codify my madhab. And then even his own students said, no, don't look at those opinions. Look at the opinions I left with so and so. This is where we have the seeds of the old and the new madhab. And we study that. When we come to books, we'll say, this is the opinion of the qadim, but this is the opinion of the jadid. Obviously, we tend to take the newer madhab over the older madhab of Imam Shafi'i, except from a few issues, and those are, you can find them in a fiqh book, very easy to access. When we get to study fiqh, we'll learn that together. So this is where the new and old, it doesn't mean that he changed his mind. It doesn't mean that he saw stuff in Egypt that people have a false tafsir. It's just the man's mind is working and growing, and therefore he has an updated way of looking at things. So I guess I don't have enough, time is running out for me. I don't have enough time to go into the other stage one. We'll do that for the next lecture. But the old and the new madhab is very important because this is one of the first terminologies that you're going to learn in the Shafi'i madhab that you have to be aware of. These have to do with opinions of furu'a, by the way, opinions of Islamic law, not necessarily positions of usul, because we don't really have access to the first risala. All we have in manuscript form is the second risala. And we'll put a pin in it here and pick up in the next lecture, inshallah. Allah ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So today's lecture, even though it comes in the middle of the course, is like an introduction to the rest of the lectures, in which we are able to talk and share with each other about the different historical stages of the Shafi'i madhab that we are going to talk about. There are the four big, let's call them big stages, and then there are the 6 smaller stages, which I will use to help organize the teaching material for the rest of the lectures. The way that I organize the teaching materials for the rest of the lecture, a lot of it has to do with just making the flow of each lecture work, so I don't have to necessarily hold you to that, but the first or the larger framework, that is something that you need to memorize. It's very easy, which it's the life and death of Imam Shafi'i, and then it's the transmission of the madhab until about the year 500, and then there's the middle period, the period after that, from the year 500 until the year 676, which ends with the first tanqiyah of the madhab with Imam al-Rafi and Imam al-Nawawi. And then the period after that is from the death of Imam al-Nawawi up until the year 1004, which is the death of Imam al-Ramli. And then the second tanqiyah is what takes place between the intellectual efforts of al-Haytami and al-Ramli. So those four basic blocks you have to have memorized, because you will come to see that each tanqiyah of the madhab has a tremendous impact in how the madhab is discussed, taught, and written about. So it's justified that those become milestones of the madhab. After that, I gave you we also had quite an extensive discussion on ijtihad. So it's important that we remember that there is a type of ijtihad that no longer exists, but that's the ijtihad that establishes the rules of usul al-fiqh itself. But what is other than that, that type of ijtihad is open for all of time, and it's something that we will find very prevalent within the Shafi'i madhab, that many of the people we will discuss were mujtahids themselves. And then, after giving you my sort of 6 stages that I'm going to be using in detail, you can just listen to that again, I don't have to review it here. I began by talking about the first stage, but I didn't get very far into it. But we talked about why there is the old and the new school of Imam al-Shafi'i. We narrated the story of al-Karabisi, who wanted to take from him the madhab, and Imam al-Shafi'i said, no, take the books that I left with the Za'farani. Those are the more updated opinions. So it is from that interaction that we have an old and new opinion, old and new madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i. And usually we tend to take the newer positions, but there are some instances where we revert to the old positions. As we will come to see, that's what people like people like Imam Nawawi did, is they said, no, in this mas'ala we should take the old opinion, not the new opinion, because it's more coherent with the usul of the madhab, etc. All of that will come inshallah later. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.